Welcome to Reveal Fears. Subscribe and like this video.
Part 1: The Mask. The rain lashed at my windshield as I pulled up to the crime scene. The squad cars cast eerie red and blue strobes over the narrow alley, painting the soaked brick walls with fleeting streaks of light. Another night, another body. My badge felt heavier in my pocket than usual. The victim was sprawled in the center of the alley, limbs bent at unnatural angles. Forensics had barely begun, their white jumpsuits glistening in the downpour. The air reeked of damp asphalt and copper, a smell I'd grown to know too well. "Detective Carter!" a young officer called out, snapping me from my grim thoughts. "You'll want to see this." I nodded, stepping over a puddle that seemed as deep as my exhaustion. The victim's face was obscured by a grotesque mask, vividly painted, its features distorted into a macabre grin. A clown mask. My stomach tightened. The officer handed me a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a note, the words crudely scrawled in red ink. "Do you know why we laugh, detective?" I swallowed hard. This wasn't just a murder. It was an invitation. Part 2: The Pattern. Back at the precinct, I spread the photographs across my desk. Each one was a nightmare in still life. The victim, a young woman in her mid-20s, lay splayed in the alley, the garish clown mask still mocking her lifeless form. The note felt like it was burning a hole in the evidence bag as I scrutinized every detail. "Another one," said a voice behind me. "Detective Marlowe, my partner." He tossed his soaked trench coat over a chair and leaned in to study the photos. His face was grave. "Same signature as the others," I replied, gesturing to the mask in the photo. "And the note. Same handwriting. This one's different, though," Marlowe said, pointing at the victim's hands. Her fingers were stiff and curled, clawing at her own face as though she tried to tear the mask off before death. I nodded grimly. "The others didn't fight back." Marlowe grabbed a folder from the desk. It was already thick, the previous murders stacked neatly inside. 3 victims in the last 2 months. All young, all left in public spaces. Same MO. And all with those damned masks. "But this one," I trailed off, tapping the note. "Why do we laugh, detective?" "It's addressed to me this time." "You've been on the news," Marlowe said. "The press loves talking about this case. Maybe our guy does too. Or maybe he's just warming up," I muttered. A knock interrupted our grim assessment. A rookie poked his head into the room. "There's something you need to see, sir. It's on the precinct's public notice board." Marlowe and I exchanged glances and followed him out. Pinned to the board, amidst flyers for bake sales and departmental reminders, was another note. This one wasn't in a plastic bag. It was taped up for anyone to see. The same messy red ink scrawled across the page. "Comedy is tragedy wearing a smile. Ready for the next act?" Below it was a Polaroid. A woman sitting in a dark room, her face pale with terror. A clock in the background read 10:15 p.m. My watch said 9:48. Part 3: Racing the Clock. The precinct exploded into motion. Officers scrambled, phones rang off their hooks, and someone yelled to trace the Polaroid's origin. I stared at the photograph, the weight of the clock's digits hammering into my brain. 10:15 p.m. We had 27 minutes. "Dispatch, I want every available unit on this," Marlowe barked into his radio. "Check vacant buildings, warehouses, anywhere someone could be held." I grabbed the note off the board, careful not to smudge it. The red ink was still fresh, smearing faintly under my gloves. This wasn't just a taunt, it was a time bomb. "Look closer at the background," Marlowe said, pointing to the Polaroid. "That wallpaper, it's floral. Cheap. Could be a rundown motel. Or a stage set," I added, scanning the woman's terrified expression. Her eyes weren't just pleading, they were fixed on something out of frame. Something more horrifying than we could imagine. "Run the victim's image through the database," I ordered. "We need her ID." A tech analyst rushed to comply, the sound of her keyboard rapid fire like machine gun fire in the tense silence. Seconds dragged into eternity before her screen pinged. Got her. Cassandra Fields, age 29. Missing person report filed 3 days ago by her sister. Address? I asked, already pulling on my coat. She lives alone. Apartments on the east side, but she didn't vanish there. Last known location was a bar downtown, the analyst added. Let's go, Marlowe said, already moving. The squad car fishtailed as we sped through rain-slick streets. Red lights flashed on the dashboard, matching the pulsing adrenaline in my veins. I checked my watch, 9:58 p.m. The bar where Cassandra was last seen was small, wedged between a shuttered pawnshop and a liquor store. A flickering neon sign above the door cast a sickly green glow. Inside, it was nearly empty, save for a bartender wiping glasses and a lone patron hunched at the counter. We're with the police, I announced, flashing my badge. We need to know about Cassandra Fields. She was last seen here. The bartender paused, his face twisting into a mix of confusion and worry. Cassie? Yeah, she was here a few nights ago. Left around midnight. She said something about heading home, but what? Marlowe pressed. She looked spooked, the bartender admitted. Kept glancing over her shoulder, like someone was watching her. I swore under my breath. Another piece of the puzzle, another lead too late to stop her abduction. My phone buzzed as we got back into the car. It was the precinct. Carter, I answered. We traced the ink from the note, the tech analyst said. It's a rare type of marker, only sold at specialty stores. We cross-referenced with local purchases. There's one match, a store near the Old Theater District. The Old Theater District. The crumbling relics of a once vibrant part of town. It was as good a place as any to stage a sick performance. I glanced at the time. 10:07 p.m. We'll check it out, I said, getting the engine. As we sped toward the theater district, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were playing right into his hands. This wasn't a manhunt, it was a show. And he was the director. Part 4, the theater. The theater district loomed ahead, its decayed grandeur suffocating under years of neglect. Faded marquees sagged like tired smiles, their letters missing or barely clinging to rusted frames. Rain streaked down cracked facades, and the once proud buildings stared back with dark, empty eyes. We screeched to a stop in front of the Rialto, an ancient theater that looked like it had been waiting for its final curtain call. I checked my watch, 10:11 p.m. 4 minutes. Carter, Marlowe said, his voice tight. This could be a trap. It is, I replied, yanking my flashlight from my belt. But we don't have a choice. The lobby doors were chained, but a side entrance hung ajar, swaying on creaking hinges. The air inside was damp, heavy with the smell of mildew and something fouler. Blood? I didn't want to dwell on it. We stepped into the theater's cavernous belly, beams of light cutting through the gloom. The lobby was cluttered with debris, torn movie posters, shattered glass, and discarded seats. Each step echoed, a ghostly applause accompanying us deeper into the dark. Back here, Marlowe whispered, motioning toward a trail of wet footprints leading down a narrow corridor. The floral wallpaper from the Polaroid clung to the walls here, curling at the edges. My pulse quickened. We were close. The trail ended at a set of double doors. Faintly, I could hear a muffled sound, whimpering? Screaming? My grip tightened on my sidearm as I nodded to Marlowe. He pushed the doors open. The auditorium stretched out before us, an abyss of broken seats and rotting carpet. On the stage, under a single, flickering spotlight, was Cassandra Fields. She was tied to a chair, her head slumped forward, the gaudy clown mask perched on her lap like a twisted companion. She was alive, barely, but the sharp heaving of her chest confirmed she hadn't been too late. Yet. Cassandra! I called out, stepping forward. She flinched and let out a strangled cry, her eyes darting toward the shadows behind her. My blood froze. A figure emerged from the wings, slow and deliberate. He was tall, lanky, dressed in a patchwork of black and white, like a jester from some nightmare. A porcelain mask covered his face, its expression eerily neutral save for the painted, blood-red smile that stretched grotesquely wide. In his hand was a knife. Long curved. "Welcome," he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "You made it just in time, detective." The audience was getting restless. My hand hovered over my holster. "Step away from her." "Oh, I intend to," the masked man replied, tilting his head. "But not before the grand finale." Marlowe was already circling, moving toward the far side of the stage. The man seemed to notice but didn't flinch. He was locked on me, his head tilted as if trying to read my thoughts. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice steady despite the pounding in my chest. "Isn't it obvious?" he replied, gesturing to the stage. "This world is a tragedy, detective, but no one knows how to laugh anymore. I'm just giving them a little perspective." He raised the knife toward Cassandra's throat. She let out a muffled scream, her eyes wide with terror. "No!" I shouted, taking a step forward. "And you," he continued, his voice turning icy, "are my critic. Always chasing, always judging. Let's see if you have the courage to join the act." I didn't hesitate. My gun was out, the shot ringing through the cavernous space as I aimed for his shoulder. But he was fast, inhumanly fast, and the bullet struck the curtain behind him as he vanished into the wings. "Go!" I yelled to Marlowe, rushing to untie Cassandra. Her sobs were choked and desperate, but she clung to me as I pulled her free. "Marlowe, don't let him!" A blood-curdling laugh echoed from somewhere deep in the theater. It was disjointed, impossible to place, as if the building itself were mocking us. "He's still here," Marlowe called out from the shadows. "He's playing with us." I helped Cassandra to her feet, my mind racing. Then we stopped playing. Part 5, The Cat and Mouse. The theater swallowed sound like a tomb, amplifying the eerie laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I handed Cassandra off to Marlowe, who guided her toward the exit. Her shaking limbs barely obeyed, and her tear-streaked face was frozen in a mask of terror. "Get her outside," I ordered. "Now." "What about you?" Marlowe asked, his voice tense. "I'm finishing this." Marlowe hesitated for half a second before nodding. He and Cassandra disappeared into the darkness, their footsteps fading as the theater grew deathly still. I turned back toward the stage, my flashlight slicing through the shadows. The laugh came again, bouncing off the walls, growing more distorted and maddening with each echo. It was a taunt daring me to follow. And I did. I crept into the wings, my gun steady in one hand, my light in the other. The smell hit me first, metallic and sour. Blood. My beam caught a streak of crimson smeared across the wall, a crude arrow pointing further into the backstage maze. "Where are you?" I growled, my voice low but firm. The laughter stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but my own breathing. Then came a whisper, so faint it felt like it was inside my skull. "Behind you." I spun, my flashlight darting across the shadows. Nothing. My pulse thundered in my ears as I strained to hear any movement. He was toying with me, like a predator circling its prey. The smell of blood grew stronger as I pushed forward, deeper into the labyrinth of rusting props and rotting costumes. The theater's skeleton creaked around me, the old building groaning under the weight of its secrets. My foot struck something soft, and I froze, light trembling as it landed on a pile of clothes. No, not clothes. A body. The victim was a man, his face obscured by yet another clown mask, this one painted in pale blue with black teardrops streaking down the cheeks. The same grotesque artistry. His throat was slashed, the blood pooling beneath him a grim testament to the killer's efficiency. A scrap of paper was pinned to his chest, the red ink glistening like fresh paint. Act 2, a tragic fool. I gritted my teeth. He was staging this, each murder a twisted performance. But what was his endgame? Behind me, something shifted, a faint creak of wood. I whirled, my flashlight catching the glint of porcelain before it disappeared again into the shadows. "Stop running!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty corridors. Face me! The only reply was the sound of footsteps, quick and light, moving deeper into the theater. I gave chase, my boots pounding against the creaking floorboards. He wanted me to follow, and I didn't care. I wanted this over. The chase ended in the rafters, high above the stage. He stood at the edge of the catwalk, his silhouette framed by the dim glow of the emergency lights. The porcelain mask gleamed, its smile frozen in mockery. In one hand he held his knife. In the other, he dangled something small and glinting. A recorder. "You're quite the leading man, detective," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "So brave, so determined. But you don't see the bigger picture, do you? Drop the knife," I commanded, my gun aimed squarely at his chest. He tilted his head, considering. "What happens when the curtain falls, Carter? What's left when the laughter dies? Enough games. Drop it, or I'll drop you." The laugh returned, low and hollow. "You don't get it. This isn't a game. It's art." He threw the recorder. I watched it plummet, heard it smash against the stage far below. And then he was gone, his figure vanishing into the darkness as I raced forward, heart pounding, gun ready. But when I reached the edge of the catwalk, all I saw was the emptiness of the stage beneath. He had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but the sound of the recorder's broken playback repeating his laughter. Part 6: The Aftermath. By the time I climbed down from the rafters, the theater was crawling with uniforms. Cassandra was in the ambulance outside, safe for the moment, but rattled beyond words. Marlowe met me near the stage, his face grim. "He's gone, isn't he?" he asked. I nodded, holstering my weapon. "Vanished into thin air. Left a body backstage, though. Same mask, same theatrics. And the recorder?" Marlowe gestured to where a forensics tech was bagging the shattered remains of the device. "Just his voice," I said. "Mocking us. Laughing." Marlowe swore under his breath. "This guy's not just a killer. He's a showman. He wants the attention." I shook my head. "No. Attention is a byproduct. He's building something, crafting a narrative. The masks, the notes, the staging. There's a purpose behind all this. And we're missing it," Marlowe finished grimly. Hours later, I sat in the precinct, staring at the Polaroids spread across the table. Each victim's mask seemed to stare back at me, their painted expressions grotesquely alive. The latest note, Act 2, a tragic fool, taunted me with its implications. He was working through acts, building a twisted play. Act 1 had been the earlier victims, scattered and seemingly unrelated. Act 2 had introduced the body at the Rialto. So what came next? I tapped the table in frustration, the rhythmic thud breaking the silence. "Think, Carter." He wasn't random. There was a theme here. The door creaked open, and Marlowe stepped in with a cup of coffee. He placed it in front of me without a word, sitting across the table. "Cassandra's stable," he said. "She's refusing to talk, though. Can't blame her. She knows something." I muttered. "She's the only one who survived. He let her live for a reason." Marlowe leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You think she's part of his plan?" I think. I hesitated, my mind racing. "I think she's Act 3. Marlowe swore again, standing abruptly. "If that's true, she's not safe." "No one is," I said, rising to my feet. "Not until we figure out what the hell he's planning." I grabbed my coat, the weight of the case bearing down on me like never before. The killer was out there, watching, waiting for his next move. And I knew, deep down, that he wouldn't stop until the final curtain fell. And he wanted me in the front row when it did. Part 7: The Survivor. Cassandra Field sat in the hospital room, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. She was wrapped in a blanket, staring vacantly at the floor. Her hands trembled as she clutched a styrofoam cup of water. Whatever she had been through, it had hollowed her out. "Cassandra," I said gently, pulling up a chair. "I'm Detective Carter. I need your help to stop him." Her eyes flicked to me, then away, as though making eye contact might pull her back into whatever nightmare she had just escaped. I know it's hard, I continued, leaning forward. But you're the only one who's seen him and lived. If we can figure out what he wants, we can stop him. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her hand shook so hard that water sloshed over the rim of the cup. Marlowe stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching with a mixture of pity and frustration. I tried again, softer this time. Cassandra, why you? Did he say anything about why he chose you? For a moment, her eyes filled with tears. Then, she whispered, so faintly I almost missed it. He called me, the Muse. The Muse? Marlowe repeated as we stepped out of the room. His voice was incredulous. What the hell does that mean? It means he's elevating this, I said. This isn't just a string of murders to him, it's a production. And he's cast Cassandra in a starring role. Marlowe frowned. She said he didn't touch her. No physical harm, no, you know. So why let her live? To send a message, I replied. She's alive because he wants us to see her as part of the story. She's a symbol. For what? Marlowe asked. That's what we need to figure out, I said grimly. Before Act 3. Back at the precinct, we dug deeper into Cassandra's background. She was a freelance artist, specializing in surrealist paintings. A quick search pulled up some of her work, distorted faces, masks, and vivid, chaotic imagery. The parallels were impossible to ignore. This guy knows her, I said, scanning her bio. He's obsessed with her art. The masks, the theatrics, it's like he's trying to bring her work to life. Marlowe peered over my shoulder. So he's a fan? Or someone who thinks she owes him something? Maybe both, I muttered. But there's more to this. He's meticulous. Every choice has meaning. My phone buzzed, interrupting my thoughts. It was the lab, I answered, and the voice on the other end sounded hurried. Detective Carter, we ran prints on the Polaroid you found at the theater. Got a partial match on a prior arrest, Marcus Blackwell. Convicted of arson 5 years ago. Paroled 6 months ago. Address? I asked, already grabbing my coat. Last known is a warehouse on the south side, the tech replied. It's condemned. Of course it was. The perfect setting for his next scene. As we sped toward the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already too late. The killer had been steps ahead of us this whole time, and if this truly was his Act 3, then the stakes were about to rise. The rain had picked up again, drumming against the windshield like a ticking clock. Time was running out, and I had the sinking feeling the killer was counting on it. Part 8. The Warehouse. The warehouse loomed like a shadow on the edge of the city, its rusted facade peeling in long, jagged strips. Rain pooled around its foundation, the water reflecting dim lights that flickered inside. It was the kind of place where nightmares felt at home. Marlowe and I stepped out of the car, our boots splashing in the puddles. A squad car idled nearby, its lights off. 2 officers were waiting by the entrance, their faces pale in the gloom. No sign of anyone, one of them said. Place is a maze. I nodded, motioning for them to stay outside. We'll check it out. Cover the exits. Marlowe glanced at me as we entered, his hand on his weapon. You think he's here? If he is, he wants us to find him, I replied. And if he isn't, he left us something to remember him by. The interior was as decrepit as the outside promised. Piles of rotting wood and rusted machinery were scattered like forgotten props on an abandoned set. The air was thick with mildew, and our flashlights illuminated the swirling mist of our breath. The sound of dripping water echoed eerily through the space. Each step felt heavier than the last, the floor creaking under our weight as if it might give way at any moment. Then we saw it. In the center of the main room, under a single dangling bulb, was another chair. This one was empty, but a mask sat on its seat, a new creation, painted in jagged, chaotic patterns of red and black. The same artistry, but more violent, more unhinged. Above the chair, scrawled on the wall in dripping red paint, was a single word. Muse. Marlowe cursed under his breath. This is about Cassandra. He's taunting us, I said, stepping closer. The mask seemed to pulse in the dim light, its grotesque features leering up at me. Or he's setting the stage for something worse. I bent down, inspecting the chair. It was bolted to the floor, and ropes hung loosely from the armrests. A faint, sickly sweet smell lingered in the air, paint mixed with something metallic. Blood. Carter! Marlowe called, his voice tense. Over here. I turned to find him standing by a door partially concealed by a stack of crates. He had his flashlight trained on a piece of paper taped to it. Another note, written in the killer's unmistakable hand. A muse deserves an audience. Turn the key, and the curtain rises. Beneath the note was a key hanging from a rusted nail. It gleamed unnaturally, as though freshly polished, a deliberate lure. This is a trap, Marlowe said, his jaw tight. You know that, right? Of course it is, I replied, my voice grim. But we're opening it. Marlowe hesitated, then nodded, drawing his weapon. I grabbed the key, the cold metal biting into my fingers as I slid it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a set of narrow stairs descending into darkness. The smell hit us immediately, stronger now, rancid and cloying. It was the smell of death. We descended slowly, every step sending echoes through the narrow stairwell. At the bottom was another room, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. And in the center of the room, a camera. It was mounted on a tripod, pointed at an empty stool. More masks were scattered around the floor, each one a variation of the killer's signature style. And taped to the camera's lens was another note. Act 3, the muse speaks. My heart sank as I realized what it meant. This wasn't a stage, it was a recording studio. Whatever the killer had planned, he wanted it preserved. And he wasn't done yet. Carter! Marlowe whispered, pointing to the corner of the room. There, barely visible in the shadows, was another door. This one was reinforced, a thick padlock hanging from its latch. We need to get that open, I said, scanning the room for anything that could help. And then the lights went out. Part 9, The Dark Stage. The darkness swallowed the room whole, pressing against me like a living thing. My flashlight was out in an instant, the beam cutting through the thick blackness. Beside me, Marlowe cursed under his breath, his light joining mine. Then, from somewhere deep in the shadows came a sound. A slow, deliberate clap. 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 You've made it to the heart of the show, detective. The killer's voice echoed, low and mocking. But you're still just an extra. Not the star. The sound reverberated off the walls, disorienting, impossible to pinpoint. I scanned the room, the flashlight's beam trembling slightly in my hand. Show yourself! I shouted. The voice laughed, a rich, theatrical sound that sent a shiver down my spine. Patience, Carter. The finale's worth waiting for. Marlowe moved toward the reinforced door, his steps cautious. I've got a crowbar in the car. If we... The killer's voice interrupted him. Ah! Don't spoil the moment. The door will open when the time is right. A metallic click echoed through the room, and my heart sank. The killer had triggered something. The camera whirred to life, its red recording light blinking on. At the same time, the fluorescence overhead flickered back, bathing the room in harsh, unsteady light. In the center of the room, the empty stool was no longer empty. Sitting on it, slumped and lifeless, was another victim. A man, his face hidden by yet another grotesque mask, this one painted entirely in black, with a jagged white smile slashed across it. Pinned to his chest was a note. The critic. The killer's voice returned, softer now, almost reverent. Every artist needs a critic, don't you think? Someone to push them, to drive them to their very best work. I felt a swell of rage. You're not an artist. You're a murderer. Aren't all great artists? He replied, his tone turning sharp. They destroy to create. The difference is, I know what I'm doing. I embraced the blood on my hands. Marlowe moved closer to the body, inspecting it carefully. Still warm. He muttered. He was here minutes ago. I nodded, my mind racing. The killer was still close. The question was, where? The reinforced door caught my attention again. It felt like the next act, waiting to unfold. But the camera was important, too. It was aimed directly at the stool and body, capturing the scene in perfect clarity. He wanted us to see this, to analyze it, to be part of the production. Carter. Marlowe called, his voice urgent. Look at this. He had pulled the mask away, revealing the victim's face. My stomach dropped. It was the bartender from the club where Cassandra was last seen. He's tying this all back to her, I said, stepping closer. Every step, every clue, it all revolves around Cassandra. She's the muse? Marlowe said. So what's the next step in the story? The killer's voice answered for us, booming through hidden speakers. The muse sings, detective. And her song will bring the house down. Before I could respond, the reinforced door creaked. Not open, but it moved, just enough to make its hinges groan. He's baiting us, Marlowe said, his hand on his weapon. And we're taking it, I replied, moving toward the door. If Cassandra's behind that door, we don't have a choice. We braced ourselves, weapons drawn, and pushed it open. Inside was a single object, sitting in the center of the small room, a phone, its screen glowing in the dim light. It was ringing. Part 10. The call. The phone's shrill tone pierced the silence, reverberating off the cold, damp walls of the small room. Marlowe's knuckles whitened as he gripped his gun, his breath steady but shallow. It's a trap, he said, his voice low. Of course it is, I replied, stepping closer. The screen glowed brighter as I picked it up, the caller ID flashing a single word, unknown. I pressed answer and raised the phone to my ear. Detective Carter. The killer's voice purred. How nice of you to join me. My jaw tightened. Where is Cassandra? She's safe, he replied, a smirk evident in his tone. For now. I must say, you've been such a captivating audience. So invested. So predictable. Your game's over, I growled. We know your name, Marcus Blackwell. We'll track you down. He laughed, a harsh, guttural sound. Names are just masks, detective. Haven't you learned that by now? Marcus Blackwell was just the beginning. A role I played. But the real show? It's just starting. Tell me where you are. I barked, but the words felt hollow. He wasn't going to give himself up. Not like this. Instead, he hummed softly, a haunting, off-key melody that sent a chill down my spine. After a moment, he spoke again, his tone dropping to something darker. Do you hear it, detective? He whispered. The ticking clock? The crescendo is coming. And when it does, the muse will take her bow. The line went dead. I lowered the phone, my thoughts racing. Marlowe stepped closer, his face etched with worry. What did he say? He's escalating, I said, pocketing the phone. Whatever's coming next, it's big. And Cassandra's at the center of it. Marlowe nodded, but his eyes flickered to something behind me. Carter, look. I turned, my flashlight illuminating the far wall. It was covered in photographs, each one pinned neatly in a grid. The pictures were of Cassandra, her in her apartment, at the bar, walking down the street. He'd been following her for months. At the center of the grid was a single Polaroid, different from the others. It showed Cassandra tied to a chair, her eyes wide with terror. Scrawled across the bottom in red ink were the words, "The Muse's final performance." The room spun around me as the implications sank in. This wasn't just another murder. He was planning something far worse. We need to move, I said, turning toward Marlowe. He's not just killing her, he's making her part of his finale. We have to find her before he... A loud crash from the main room cut me off. We bolted out, weapons drawn, only to find the camera toppled, its tripod smashed. The victim's body was gone, leaving only a pool of blood where the stool had been. He's in the building, Marlowe hissed, his gun sweeping the room. The lights flickered, and the killer's voice echoed from the speakers again. Tick-tock, detectives. The curtain's about to rise. Part 11: The Chase. The speakers fell silent, leaving the warehouse eerily still. My flashlight swept across the room, catching nothing but the overturned camera and the trail of blood leading away from where the body had been. Marlowe moved to cover my left flank, his gun raised, his every movement taut with tension. "He's baiting us," Marlowe muttered, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain outside. "Trying to split us up." "Stay close," I said, my pulse hammering in my ears. "If he's here, we're ending this now." The blood trail was faint, smeared across the floor in uneven streaks, as though something, or someone, had been dragged. It led toward another door on the far side of the room, half open and swaying slightly with the draft. Beyond it was a long corridor, its cracked concrete walls lined with flickering fluorescent lights. I stepped forward, motioning for Marlowe to cover me. The corridor seemed endless, the faint sound of dripping water echoing through it. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air thickening with the promise of violence. Then, up ahead I saw it, a figure at the far end. The killer. He stood perfectly still, his tall, thin frame silhouetted against the faint light spilling from a doorway behind him. He was wearing the same porcelain mask, its blood-red smile gleaming in the gloom. In one hand he held a long, curved knife. In the other he held a small, hand-cranked music box. The haunting tune it played filled the corridor, a warped melody that twisted in my ears. "Drop the weapon!" I shouted, raising my gun. The killer tilted his head, the movement slow and deliberate, like a puppet on invisible strings. Then he turned and walked through the door behind him, disappearing into the shadows. "Go!" I barked, sprinting after him. The doorway led to a large, open room, an old storage space cluttered with rusted machinery and decaying crates. In the center was a makeshift stage, hastily constructed from wooden pallets and draped with a stained, moth-eaten curtain. A spotlight hung overhead, casting an uneven circle of light on the center of the stage. And there she was. Cassandra. She was tied to a chair, her head slumped forward, her breathing shallow. Her hands were bound tightly with rope, and a new mask was strapped to her face, half painted in white, the other half streaked with red tears. My blood ran cold as I scanned the room. He was here. Somewhere. "Marlowe, cover me," I said, moving cautiously toward Cassandra. As I reached the stage, a voice echoed from the shadows. "Careful, detective. You wouldn't want to spoil the ending." The spotlight flickered, and I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The killer stepped into the light, standing just out of arm's reach. His knife gleamed as he twirled it lazily in his hand, the painted smile on his mask seeming to widen. "You've been such a dedicated audience," he said, his voice low and theatrical. "But every show must end. This ends now," I said, aiming my weapon at him. "Drop the knife. Step away from her." He chuckled, a hollow, soulless sound. "Do you really think you can stop it? The finale is already written. The muse has played her part. Now it's your turn." With that, he lunged, the knife flashing toward me. I fired, the shot ringing out like a thunderclap in the enclosed space. The bullet struck his shoulder, spinning him back into the shadows. "Carter, watch out!" Marlowe shouted. A loud snap echoed from above. I looked up just in time to see a counterweight falling from the rigging overhead, hurtling straight toward the stage. Part 12: The Final Curtain. The counterweight crashed down, splintering the stage in an explosion of wood and debris. I dove forward, grabbing Cassandra's chair and yanking it out of harm's way just as the spot where she'd been sitting was obliterated. "Carter!" Marlowe's voice echoed as he moved through the wreckage, gun drawn. "Where is he?" I scanned the room, coughing as dust filled the air. The killer was gone, no sign of his porcelain mask or the bloodied knife. The trail of destruction led nowhere but into the dark corners of the warehouse. "He's here," I muttered, untying Cassandra's restraints as quickly as my shaking hands allowed. "He won't leave without finishing this." Cassandra stirred weakly, her voice a faint whisper. He said you'd come. That you'd..." She broke off, her words lost in a sob. It's over now, I said, though the hollow feeling in my chest told me it wasn't true. Marlowe's flashlight darted across the room as he kicked over crates and scanned the shadows. He's bleeding. He can't have gone far. Cover the exits, I said, helping Cassandra to her feet. She was trembling, her body weak from hours of torment. He might double back. But before Marlowe could respond, the speakers in the room crackled to life. Bravo! The killer's voice rang out, dripping with mockery. What a thrilling act! The detective saves the day, the muse is spared, and the villain disappears into the night. A classic ending, wouldn't you say? I spun, searching for the source of his voice, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Where are you? I shouted, my voice raw with frustration. Closer than you think, he replied, his tone dark and gleeful. But don't worry. I've left you something to remember me by. A slow, grinding sound filled the room. I turned just in time to see a trapdoor in the floor sliding open. Beneath it was a dark, yawning pit, and inside was a sight that made my blood run cold. Masks. Dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. All painted in the killer's grotesque, signature style. Some were pristine, their colors vibrant and horrifying. Others were cracked, faded, and stained with blood. This is my gallery, the killer said, his voice almost reverent. Every artist needs a legacy, detective. These masks? They're mine. Each one tells a story. Each one is a piece of me. I stared into the abyss, the weight of his madness pressing down on me. He was more than a killer, he was a fanatic, consumed by his need to create something eternal. Marlowe joined me at the edge of the pit, his face pale. He's been doing this for years. Decades, I whispered, realization sinking in. This wasn't just a spree. This was his life's work. Before we could react, the killer's voice returned, sharp and urgent. Time's up, detective. The curtain falls for everyone. Including you. A faint beeping reached my ears, steady, rhythmic, and growing faster by the second. My heart sank as I realized what it was. Bomb! I shouted, grabbing Cassandra and pulling her toward the exit. Move now! We sprinted through the warehouse, the beeping escalating into a high-pitched whine. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the promise of destruction. Marlowe ran ahead, kicking open the side door just as the explosion tore through the building. The blast threw us forward, flames licking at our heels as we hit the pavement outside. The sound was deafening, a roar that swallowed the world. I shielded Cassandra with my body, the heat searing my skin even from a distance. When the dust settled, the warehouse was gone, reduced to a smoldering ruin. He's gone, Marlowe said, coughing as he helped me to my feet. No one could have survived that. I stared at the wreckage, my mind racing. He couldn't be dead. Not like this. Not without a final bow. But then I saw it, perched on a twisted beam, untouched by the flames, was one of his masks. Its smile was wide, mocking, eternal. Epilogue. Weeks passed. Cassandra was in protective custody, slowly recovering from her ordeal. The case was officially closed, though it felt far from resolved. The killer's body was never found. And yet, the masks kept appearing. A courier delivered one to the precinct, addressed to me. Another was found in the alley behind my apartment. Each one was different, but they all carried the same message, etched on the inside in blood-red ink. The show must go on.
Subscribe and like this video.